The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would forever divide my life into before and after. My neighbor Mrs. Chen's voice trembled through the phone speaker, barely coherent between sobs and gasps of outrage. "Danny, you need to get over here, right now. They burned it. Oh God, they actually burned it." I stumbled out of bed, my mind foggy with sleep and confusion. "Burned what, Mrs. Chen? Who burned what?" "Your father's uniform, the marine dress blues, the HOA. They held an emergency meeting tonight while you were at work. They said it was a violation of the community standards, that military displays were politically divisive and had to be removed immediately." The words hit me like shrapnel. My father's dress blue uniform, the same one he'd worn when he received the Purple Heart after losing his leg in Fallujah, the same one he'd been buried in just 6 months ago, had been hanging in our front window as a memorial. It was all I had left of him, the only piece of his service that hadn't been buried 6 feet under Virginia clay. I threw on clothes and sprinted the 3 blocks to our family home, the one Dad had bought with his VA loan in 2003, the one where he'd raised me alone after Mom died in that car accident when I was 12. The acrid smell of smoke hit me before I even turned onto Maple Street, and my heart began hammering against my ribs like a caged animal desperate for escape. The scene that greeted me was worse than any nightmare my PTSD-addled brain had ever conjured. In the center of what used to be our well-maintained front lawn, the lawn Dad had mowed religiously every Saturday morning until the cancer took that simple joy from him too, sat a metal trash barrel, smoke still curling lazily into the pre-dawn darkness. Scattered around it like the aftermath of a battlefield were the charred remains of fabric, melted buttons that had once gleamed with military precision, and the twisted metal frame of what had been the display case. Mrs. Chen stood on her porch, in her bathrobe, tears streaming down her weathered face. Behind her, I could see other neighbors peering through curtains and blinds, some with expressions of horror, others with what looked disturbingly like satisfaction. The HOA president, Margaret Whitmore, stood beside the barrel with 3 other board members, all of them wearing expressions of grim righteousness that made my stomach churn. "You had no right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper as I approached the smoldering remains. "That was my father's uniform. That was his memorial." Margaret, a woman whose greatest military experience was probably watching war movies, straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin with an authority she'd never earned. "Mr. Morrison, we sent you 3 written notices about the violation. Military displays are not permitted under Section 4.7 of our community guidelines. They create division and controversy among residents." Division? The word came out as a snarl. I knelt beside the barrel, my hands shaking as I reached for a piece of charred fabric that might have once been part of his jacket. My father served 3 tours in Iraq. He lost his leg defending the freedom that allows you to live in your comfortable little bubble. This uniform wasn't political. It was a memorial to a man who gave everything for his country. "We understand your attachment," Margaret continued, her tone dripping with condescension. "But rules are rules. The community voted, and military displays were deemed inappropriate for our family-friendly environment." I stood slowly, the burnt fabric still clutched in my trembling fist. Around me, I could feel the weight of watching eyes, the collective judgment of neighbors who had never spoken to my father, but felt qualified to erase his memory. Some of these people had lived here for years, had seen Dad struggle with his prosthetic leg as he maintained the house that was now mine, had watched him raise a troubled teenager while battling his own demons from the war. "When did this vote happen?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Last month. We sent notices to all residents." "I never received a notice." Margaret's smile was sharp as a blade. "We sent it to the registered homeowner. Since you're not on the deed..." The implication hung in the air like smoke from the barrel. I wasn't officially the homeowner yet. Dad's estate was still working its way through probate, a process that had been delayed by the complexity of his VA benefits and the medical bills from his final months. Technically, I was just living, in the house, maintaining it, paying the utilities and HOA fees, but I had no official voice in community decisions. "You waited until you knew I couldn't vote," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "You planned this." "We followed proper procedure," Margaret replied, but I caught the flicker of guilt in her eyes. "The community has spoken. Military displays are no longer permitted. Period." I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, people I'd grown up around, people who had once brought casseroles when Dad was going through chemo, people who had attended his funeral and shaken my hand and promised they'd be there if I needed anything. Now they avoided my gaze, suddenly fascinated by their shoes or the sky or anything that wasn't the devastation of my father's memory. Only Mrs. Chen met my eyes, and what I saw there was a reflection of my own fury and heartbreak. She'd emigrated from Taiwan in the 1970s, had built a life here through decades of quiet dignity and hard work. Her own son had served in Afghanistan, and she understood what that uniform represented in ways these suburban warriors never could. "How many of you were at his funeral?" I asked, my voice carrying across the gathering crowd. "How many of you shook my hand and told me what a good man he was? How many of you said you were grateful for his service?" Silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any condemnation. "He used to tell me about Vietnam," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "About coming home to protests and being called a baby killer. He said it nearly broke him, the way his own country turned its back on the men who answered the call. He made me promise that if I ever served, I'd hold my head high no matter how people treated me, because the uniform meant something bigger than their small-minded prejudices." I held up the piece of charred fabric. This was his dress blue jacket. He wore it when he married my mother. He wore it to my high school graduation. He wore it the day he got his Purple Heart, standing on one leg because he'd left the other one in a crater outside Baghdad. And you burned it like it was garbage. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "Mr. Morrison, we understand you're upset." "But upset?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Lady, upset is when someone cuts you off in traffic. This is desecration. This is the destruction of a war hero's memorial by people who've never risked anything more dangerous than a paper cut." I turned to address the gathered crowd, my voice carrying the weight of grief and rage that had been building for months. "You want to know what creates division in a community? It's not honoring our veterans, it's cowardice. It's the kind of small-minded thinking that sees a memorial to service and sacrifice and calls it controversial." Behind me, I heard Mrs. Chen's voice, strong despite her tears. "Shame on all of you. Shame on every one of you who stood by and let this happen." But it was too late for shame. The damage was done, the uniform reduced to ashes and memories. As I stood there in the growing light of dawn, surrounded by the remnants of my father's legacy, I felt something cold and hard crystallize in my chest. This wasn't just about a uniform anymore. This was about respect, about memory, about the debt owed to those who serve. Margaret and her board members began to disperse, their work done, their community improved by the erasure of anything that might remind them of the cost of their comfortable lives. But as they walked away, I called out one final time. "This isn't over." Margaret paused, turned back with that same condescending smile. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you're grieving, but threats won't change." "Not a threat," I interrupted, my voice steady as bedrock. "A promise. You want to play by the rules? Fine. Let's see how well you know the rules you're so fond of hiding behind." As the crowd finally dispersed and the sun climbed higher into the Virginia sky, I knelt again beside the barrel, carefully collecting every scrap of fabric, every melted button, every piece of twisted metal that had once held my father's memory, with dignity and honor. Mrs. Chen helped me, her small hands gentle as she gathered the remains of what had been a symbol of service and sacrifice. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. I looked at the house where I'd grown up, at the neighborhood where my father had tried to build a life after war, at the faces disappearing behind curtains and closing doors. In my pocket, my phone buzzed with messages from other veterans in the community, word already spreading through networks forged in shared service and mutual respect. "I'm going to show them what armed for justice really means," I said, carefully placing the last piece of charred fabric into the box I'd brought from the house. "And I'm going to make sure this never happens to another military family." The war for my father's memory had begun, and unlike the battles he'd fought overseas, this one would be fought with lawyers and legislation, with community organizing and righteous fury. They'd burned his uniform, but they'd ignited something far more dangerous. The determination of a son who'd learned from a Marine that some battles are worth fighting, no matter the cost. As I carried the remains of 3 weeks after they burned my father's uniform, I walked into the Fairfax County Community Center carrying a briefcase that would become Margaret Whitmore's worst nightmare. But I wasn't alone. Behind me marched an army that the HOA had never seen coming. The monthly community meeting was typically attended by maybe a dozen residents, usually the same handful of busybodies who lived for the petty drama of neighborhood politics. Tonight, however, every seat in the community room was filled, and people lined the walls like soldiers in formation. Veterans from 3 counties had answered the call, some in wheelchairs, some missing limbs, some bearing the invisible scars of PTSD, but all united by a bond forged in service and now strengthened by outrage. Margaret sat at the head table, with her board members, her usual confidence wavering as she surveyed the crowd. I recognized the look. It was the same expression Dad used to describe seeing on insurgents' faces when they realized they'd walked into a trap. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, standing at the podium they'd never expected me to claim, "my name is Daniel Morrison, and I'm here to discuss Section 4.7 of your community guidelines, the one you used to justify burning my father's Marine dress uniform." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret banged her gavel, trying to maintain control. "Mr. Morrison, this is a community meeting for residents only. I'm afraid you'll need to—" "Actually, Margaret," I interrupted, opening my briefcase. With deliberate precision, "I am a resident. As of yesterday, the probate court officially transferred the deed to 1247 Maple Street into my name. I now have full standing in this community, including the right to call for votes, propose amendments, and challenge existing regulations." I pulled out a thick manila folder and set it on the podium. "But that's just the beginning. You see, burning my father's uniform was the worst mistake you could have made, because it forced me to actually read the HOA covenant, all 847 pages of it." The color drained from Margaret's face. Behind her, board member Carl Jenkins shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'd done my homework on all of them. "Did you know, for instance, that according to Section 12.3 of the original covenant, signed in 1987 when this community was established, any display honoring military service is explicitly protected and cannot be regulated by the HOA board? It was written by the developer, a Korean War veteran named Samuel Patterson, who wanted to ensure that military families would always feel welcome here." I held up a copy of the original document, authenticated by the county clerk. This protection was illegally removed in 2018 during a covenant update that was never properly voted on by the community. According to Virginia state law, such changes require a 2/3 majority vote of all homeowners, not just those present at a meeting. Margaret tried to interrupt, but I continued, my voice growing stronger. The 2018 changes were pushed through by a voice vote with only 14 people present out of 312 homeowners. That's roughly 4% of the community making decisions for everyone else. An angry murmur rose from the crowd. Behind me, I heard Mrs. Patterson, Samuel Patterson's widow, whom I'd tracked down in an assisted living facility, speak in a voice that carried despite her age. "My husband would roll over in his grave if he knew what you people had done. He put that military protection clause in specifically because he remembered how badly veterans were treated after Vietnam. He never wanted that to happen in his neighborhood." I turned back to Margaret, who looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. "But here's where it gets really interesting, Margaret. I did some digging into your background. Turns out, you've been living in violation of the HOA covenant for over 3 years. The room went dead silent. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Section 8.4 clearly states that home-based businesses require prior approval from the HOA board. Your little Mary Kay Cosmetics operation that you run out of your garage, the one where you host parties twice a week and have customers parking on the street, never approved, never even declared." I pulled out a stack of photographs. "These are pictures of your illegal business operation, complete with timestamps. Based on the covenant violation fee structure, you owe the community approximately $47,000 in accumulated fines." Carl Jenkins jumped to his feet. "You can't just come in here and—" "Sit down, Carl," I said calmly. I'm not done with you yet. Did you know your fence extends 18 inches onto community property? And that your tool shed violates the setback requirements by 4 feet? Oh, and that swimming pool you installed last summer without permits? The county has some very interesting questions about that. One by one, I systematically destroyed each board member. Sandra Wheeler, the secretary, had been illegally subletting her basement apartment. Tom Rodriguez, the treasurer, had been skimming money from the community fund to pay for his son's college tuition, something I'd discovered when a veteran friend who worked in forensic accounting volunteered to audit the books. Now, I continued, let's talk about what armed for justice really means. You see, Margaret, you made a critical error in judgment. You assumed that because I was grieving, because I was alone, I would be easy to push around. You forgot that my father raised me, and he was a Marine. I gestured to the crowd behind me. Marines don't fight alone. We fight as a unit. And when you attack one of us, you attack all of us. A man in the front row stood up. I recognized him as Colonel James Martinez, retired, who'd driven down from Maryland when he heard what happened. My name is James Martinez. I served with gunnery. Sergeant Morrison in Iraq. Danny's father saved my life twice, and I owe him a debt I can never repay. When I heard what this HOA did to his memorial, I made some calls. Another veteran stood. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, Army Rangers. I didn't know Gunny Morrison personally, but I know what that uniform meant. What you people did was an act of desecration, plain and simple. One by one, veterans throughout the room stood and identified themselves. Active duty, retired, wounded warriors, Gold Star families, a force that Margaret's little kingdom had never faced before. Between us, I said, we represent about 40 years of combined legal experience, 30 years of public relations expertise, connections to every major veterans organization in the country, and contacts in media outlets from here to San Diego. We are quite literally armed with knowledge, experience, and righteous fury. I opened another folder. We've already filed complaints with the Virginia Attorney General's office regarding the illegal covenant changes. We've submitted a formal complaint to the county about multiple building code violations by board members. We've contacted the IRS about potential tax evasion related to unreported business income and misappropriated HOA funds. Margaret was visibly trembling now. What do you want? Justice, I said simply. First, the HOA will publicly apologize for the destruction of my father's memorial. Second, you will pay for a replacement dress blue uniform to be displayed in the community center with a permanent plaque honoring all veterans who have lived in this neighborhood. Third, the military protection clause will be restored to the covenant, and a memorial garden will be established where families can honor their loved ones who served. I pulled out one final document. Fourth, there will be a complete change in HOA leadership. I have here petitions signed by 217 homeowners, more than the 2/3 majority required, calling for the immediate removal of the current board and new elections. The room erupted in applause. Margaret banged her gavel frantically, but it was too late. The revolution had begun. And finally, I said, my voice cutting through the noise, never again will a military family in this community be made to feel unwelcome or ashamed of their service. Never again will someone's sacrifice be deemed politically divisive by people who've never risked anything for their neighbor's freedom. Colonel Martinez stepped forward. The American Legion, VFW, and disabled American veterans have all voted to establish a permanent presence in this community. We'll be monitoring HOA decisions to ensure that military families are treated with the respect they deserve. As the meeting devolved into chaos, with Margaret and her cronies gathering their things in panicked haste, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Mrs. Chen stood beside me, tears in her eyes but a fierce smile on her face. Your father would be so proud, she whispered. You didn't just get justice, you got it the right way. Over the following weeks, the story spread like wildfire through social media and veterans networks. The HOA uniform burning became a rallying cry for military families across the country facing similar discrimination. Margaret Whitmore quietly resigned and put her house up for sale. The other board members followed suit, either resigning in disgrace or being voted out in the emergency election. The new board, led by Mrs. Patterson and including 3 veterans, immediately restored the military protection clause and established the memorial garden I'd proposed. The first monument installed was a bronze plaque honoring my father, paid for by donations from veterans nationwide who'd heard his story. But the most meaningful victory came on a quiet Sunday morning 3 months later. I was working in the memorial garden, planting flowers around Dad's plaque, when I noticed something that made my chest tight with emotion. Hanging in windows throughout the inn,